The siege had lasted 47 days when the eastern wall finally gave way. Dawn light barely penetrated the smoke hanging over the courtyard, thick as matted wool, carrying the acrid stench of burnt timber and something far older. Fear sweat, the metallic bite of blood already spilled. Lady Isabeau de Montfort stood at the tower window, 23 years old, fingers gripping stone that remained cold despite the fires raging in the bailey below. She had not slept in 3 days, had not eaten in 5, but sleep and sustenance no longer mattered. Through the choking haze, she watched the wall crack like a broken tooth, heard the thunder of its stone that had withstood 3 generations of winter storms collapsing in seconds under the trebuchet's final, devastating blow. Then came the silence. Worse than the impact itself, the terrible pause before hell arrived in flesh and iron. Isabeau had heard the stories. Every noblewoman had. Whispers exchanged in solar chambers when men were not present, warnings passed from mother to daughter like dark heirlooms. What happened to ladies of rank when castles fell? The fates considered so shameful that chroniclers refused to document them fully, leaving only gaps in records where women's names should have been absences that screamed louder than any written testimony. She had always imagined death would come swiftly. An arrow, a blade, perhaps drowning if she chose the well before the gates opened. Clean endings befitting noble birth. What she did not know what, none of them knew, until those first armored figures poured through the shattered wall like plague through a wound, was that death was not the plan. Death would have been mercy. What awaited captured noblewomen was something far more calculated, more cruel, more permanent than any grave. The conquerors wanted them alive. Below in the great hall, 11 other women huddled together, baronesses, a countess, merchant wives wealthy enough to matter, and 3 nuns from the adjacent priory who had sought refuge behind castle walls when the siege began. Among them, Sister Magdalena, barely 19, still whispered psalms beneath her breath even as iron-shod boots thundered closer. When the solar door finally splintered inward, Isabeau understood with sudden, visceral clarity that true ordeal was only beginning. Medieval nobility operated on a currency more valuable than gold or territory. Bloodline, legitimacy, honor. A noblewoman embodied all 3. Her virtue guaranteed the purity of heirs. Her reputation upheld family standing. Her body was the vessel through which land titles, alliances, and dynastic claims flowed across generations. To control a noblewoman was to control the future itself, to determine which children bore legitimate claim to castles, which marriages could be forged, which family lines would endure or be extinguished. This was why their fate after conquest followed such precise, calculated patterns. Knights and warlords understood instinctively what chroniclers later struggled to articulate. Killing a noblewoman was wasteful. She could be ransomed once. Her death brought brief satisfaction, but keeping her alive, degrading her systematically, destroying her social position while preserving her breath, that was power. That was conquest made permanent. Accounts from the Fourth Crusade describe specific protocols. Records discovered in Venetian archives document transactions that turned noblewomen into property. Letters intercepted during the siege of Constantinople in 1204 reveal pricing structures: countesses worth more than baronesses, virgins commanding premium value, nuns representing specialized commodities due to their broken vows, adding layers of shame. The mathematics were brutally simple. A captured noblewoman could not inherit, could not legitimize heirs, could not uphold family honor, and if she was forced into circumstances that made her damaged goods, according to feudal law and church doctrine, she became a ghost, legally alive, but socially dead, unable to return to her former position, even if eventually freed. This was the trap that closed around Isabeau and the others as armored men filled the solar, not execution, transformation, the systematic destruction of everything that made them noble while their hearts continued beating. What followed was a process refined through centuries of warfare. tested, perfected, documented in fragments that historians still struggle to piece together from monastery records, legal disputes over inheritance, and testimony given decades later by women who survived to old age if survival is the proper word for what they endured. They began with symbols. The soldiers moved through the solar with practiced efficiency, tearing away everything that marked noble status. Rings, first gold bands engraved with family seals wrenched from fingers still trembling. Some came off easily, others required force. One woman's finger broke with an audible snap when she instinctively made a fist, unwilling to surrender her grandmother's ruby. She received a blow across the face that split her lip. The ring was taken anyway. Circlets next. The delicate crowns of worked silver and semi-precious stones that indicated rank disappeared into leather sacks. Then the mantles, fur-lined cloaks that cost more than a peasant earned in a lifetime. The fine linen wimples that covered noble hair in accordance with church teaching. The embroidered girdles that signaled married status and family allegiance. Within 20 minutes they stood stripped to simple undergarments, shivering despite the summer heat still trapped in stone walls. No longer ladies. No longer wives or daughters or sisters of powerful men. Just bodies, flesh, property waiting to be assigned purpose. But the stripping was merely preparation. Countess Elena Comnena, 41 years old, descended from Byzantine emperors, was dragged to the courtyard, still crowded with soldiers celebrating their victory. She was forced to her knees in the mud where horses had been watered. In front of 300 men, her hair was shorn with the same shears used for sheep rough blades that caught and tore, leaving her scalp bleeding in places where chunks of skin came away with stubborn roots. This was not random cruelty. Hair held profound significance. Noble hair, grown long and carefully tended, represented feminine virtue and social standing. Cutting it marked prostitutes, adulteresses, and criminals. By shearing a countess like livestock, her captors were making a decoration visible to everyone present. Rank meant nothing now. She was less than nothing. Isabeau watched from the tower window, still under guard, as Elena was paraded through the camp afterward. Not killed, not hidden away, displayed. Her noble bearing reduced to a spectacle of humiliation as soldiers jeered and spat. The message was clear. This fate awaited all of them. The true horror had barely begun. Within a week, the marriages started. Not unions blessed by the church, or negotiated between families with careful attention to lineage and dowry. Forced bonds designed specifically to contaminate noble bloodlines with common or enemy blood. Isabeau was given to a Flemish mercenary captain. His name was Godefroy. He was illiterate, scarred, and had earned his position through violence rather than birth. Under any normal circumstance, he would have been forbidden even to speak directly to a woman of her standing. Now he owned her as completely as he owned his sword. The ceremony was a mockery of sacred rites. No priest officiated, no family witnessed. A camp chaplain mumbled Latin phrases while soldiers laughed and drank. When it was done, she was wife to a man whose bloodline would destroy any claim her children might have to her father's lands. Any heir produced would be base-born in the eyes of law, unable to inherit, unable to continue the de Montfort name. This was the calculation. Not rape as random violence, but rape as institutional destruction. Every pregnancy eliminated a legitimate heir. Every child born erased a piece of noble continuity. Ottoman records from later centuries document systematic programs with similar logic. When Constantinople fell in 1453, captured Byzantine noblewomen were distributed to janissaries and officials, specifically to break imperial bloodlines. The empire's genetic claim to legitimacy was extinguished not through execution, but through forced breeding with the conquerors. Medieval knights employed the same strategy centuries earlier. Baroness Marie de Lisle, 34 years old, mother of 3 legitimate sons safely in fosterage elsewhere, was given to a common foot soldier. Her noble womb would now produce peasant children. Worse, the very act of consummation made her damaged goods. Even if eventually ransomed or freed, church law made her unfit to remarry nobility. She could never again fulfill the function for which she had been raised, producing legitimate heirs. Sister Magdalena faced specialized torment. Nuns were brides of Christ. Their virginity was not merely physical, but spiritual, a consecrated state that defined their entire existence. When she was dragged from the chapel and given to a knight who had taken 7 other women as concubines, the violation was not just of her body, but of her sacred vows. Her soul itself was the target. At night, locked in chambers that had once housed servants, the women whispered to each other, shared their horror, but also their confusion. Why keep them alive? Why not simply kill them and be done with it? The answer was becoming brutally clear. Dead noblewomen were footnotes. Living noblewomen, visibly degraded and powerless, were warnings. Monuments to conquest that breathed and bled and demonstrated exactly what happened when resistance failed. The assault on women in religious orders followed particular patterns of calculated desecration. When Crusader armies swept through Byzantine territories during the Fourth Crusade, convents became primary targets, not despite their sacred status, but because of it. Monastery records later revealed why. Nuns represented the highest form of female spiritual authority. Their destruction carried symbolic weight, far beyond individual suffering. Sister Magdalena had entered religious life at 16. 3 years of prayer, of contemplation, of building a relationship with the divine that required absolute purity. She had renounced worldly marriage, worldly wealth, worldly family, to become something greater, a vessel for God's grace, untouchable by the corruption of flesh. That sanctity made her violation more valuable. The knight who took her as concubine was Robert de Clary. He kept a list of his conquests, later discovered in French archives, properties seized, treasures claimed, women acquired. Sister Magdalena appeared between a silver chalice and a warhorse. 15 deniers, her assessed worth, the price of a serviceable sword. But value was not the point. The point was degradation, to force acts that stripped her vows of meaning, transforming her from bride of Christ into property of man. Each night survived eroded her sacred identity, worn down slowly until nothing remained of who she had been. Others fared worse. Some nuns were forced into brothels established in captured cities. This was deliberate. If consecrated women could be reduced to prostitution, the Church's authority itself was undermined. What protection did vows offer if even nuns could be broken? The cruelty was systematic. Medieval society allowed women 3 roles: virgin, wife, widow, each defined by men. Nuns formed a rare 4th category, consecrated virgins with authority to teach, manage property, advise bishops. Destroying that category eliminated women's only path to power outside male control. Sister Magdalena never stopped praying. Not for deliverance, she no longer expected that, but because prayer was the last thing that belonged to her, the final piece of self they could not take unless she surrendered it. She never did. In that narrow space she endured. What followed was worse. Chroniclers used euphemisms, displayed as spoiled, paraded for satisfaction. Letters in ecclesiastical archives were clearer. High-born women were kept in cages, not cells. Iron cages barely large enough to stand, exposed to weather and crowds, placed in public squares. Isabeau spent 4 months in one. Her cage stood near the well and the market. Anyone who needed water or bread passed her. Hundreds of eyes each day. Thousands of words, judgments, jokes, comparisons. The cage forced her to crouch or stand. No privacy, no shelter. Food came once daily, scraps tossed through bars. Physical suffering was survivable. Psychological destruction was not. Former servants passed without deference. Soldiers commented on her body. Children asked why a woman lived in a chicken cage. Each moment erased a piece of the person she had been. Countess Elena occupied the cage beside hers. She no longer spoke. Her eyes had retreated somewhere unreachable, beyond further humiliation. Records suggest nearly 30% of captured noblewomen became permanently catatonic. Modern medicine calls it dissociation. Others chose death. They refused food until their bodies failed. Weeks of fading. A final act of resistance captors could not prevent. Isabeau considered it daily, but stubbornness or endurance kept her alive. Waiting felt like defiance. At night, she found names scratched into the rusted iron beneath her feet. Maria, Catherine, Anne. Marks left by previous occupants insisting they had existed. She added her own, carving for hours with a broken shard until her name appeared. If she died here, someone might know she had been human. They resisted quietly. In servants' quarters, Baroness Marie de Lille insisted the women braid each other's hair each morning. 10 minutes of gentleness. No practical purpose. Only recognition. In a chapel used for penance labor, Sister Magdalena carved names beneath the altar with a broken nail. The names of nuns killed in the assault. Nearly invisible. Permanent. Isabeau recited her lineage twice daily. 11 generations. Names and holdings whispered like prayers. They could take her body, not her memory. These acts changed nothing. Saved no one. But they preserved humanity. Lady Constance, 52, organized whispered instruction for younger captives who to avoid, how to hide objects, how to clean wounds, how to remain sane. Her guidance saved lives, not by escape, but by survival. When Constance died of an untreated fever, 12 women held a clandestine funeral in the crypt. No priest, no priest, no permission. They scratched her name beside the others. Constance de Beaumont, born noble, died in chains. Isabeau waited 7 months for ransom. The demand was modest, 2,500 marks, affordable. The reply arrived 6 weeks later. The de Montfort line requires women of unblemished virtue. Isabeau's circumstances render her unsuitable for return. She had been abandoned, not for cost, for dishonor. Records confirm the pattern. Of 137 captured noblewomen with documented ransom negotiations, only 48 were reclaimed. Families cited the same reason. A woman publicly degraded could not marry, inherit, or restore honor. Better erased. Convents erased survivors too. Orders struck captured nuns from rolls rather than admit they lived in violation. The Church preferred martyrs to women who exposed the limits of divine protection. Countess Elena's family never responded. She reminded them of Byzantine collapse. Forgetting was easier. The abandoned women became family to each other, bonds forged not by blood, but by shared knowledge that they were expendable. Isabeau stopped waiting. She survived for its own sake. She lived 41 more years. When the army moved on, outcomes varied. Many died. Some survived on society's margins. A few rebuilt lives in the gaps between categories. Isabeau became a weaver. Her noble identity died in the cage. What emerged, remembered. In a hospital chapel funded by merchants, she commissioned a carving beneath the altar. Names, dozens. Women erased by families and history. Archaeologists uncovered it in 1987. For centuries, scholars thought the names were donors or saints. They were neither. They were a survivor's memorial. What happened to these women was not rare. Similar treatment appears across medieval warfare, the Fourth Crusade, the 100 Years' War, border conflicts. When conquest needed to be visible, noble women's bodies became proof. The numbers are unknowable. Thousands, likely more. Lives erased because acknowledging them meant admitting failure. Their names are mostly gone. But they existed. If this story matters to you, remembering matters. These women had no voice then. Refusing silence now is the least we can offer. The chapel still stands in Montbéliard. The names remain worn but present. They were meant to vanish. They did not.